Hi booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be wrapping up everything that I read in the month of November, and then I'll be going through to my plans as they stand for the moment for December, for finishing off the year. November was a pretty good reading month. I sort of finished off a few things I've been working on for a bit, and then I carried on with some projects, did a bit of reading that felt like a fun sort of diversion from a lot of what I've been reading recently. So quite a fun mix of things on the whole. I'll start off with Gabriela Mistral, a Chilean poet, and I read this selection of her prose and her prose poems. This is edited and translated by Stephen Tapscott, and this was really quite interesting. On the whole, I think it was just valuable in getting me a bit of a deeper impression of what she was like as a poet, and what her, I suppose, what her character was, what was important to her. Certainly teaching was very important to her. A sort of sense of, I don't know, a sort of sense of connection both to her country and to other Latin Americans as well. That sort of came across sort of quite strongly in a very earthy kind of way. And on the whole, the selection was kind of a mix on the whole for me. I liked the first section where it was mainly sort of almost fables and sort of mini myths about the origin of animals and of elements and of, things you might find in nature. And they had a fun sense of playfulness to them. And then on to Desolation, or some of the prose poems and prose pieces from Desolation, which was more of a mix. There were bits I enjoyed and bits I enjoyed less. And then really the bit that stood out to me the most was in the middle, or maybe slightly towards the end. And it's these two, what she'd describe as lyrical biographies. The kind of saints' lives. So there's one of Saint Francis, and one of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who I'm not particularly, I don't really know all too much about her, but I really enjoyed her sort of profile of her life. I had a lot of fun with that. And then it ends off with some other prose pieces. Maybe one of my favourites was one called If Napoleon Had Never Existed, which is mainly about a conversation that she has with someone she's overseas, and I think Chile was undergoing a lot of political change while she was away, and so this sort of conversation with this random person about her own country sort of ends up with this hypothetical conversation about what the world might be like if Napoleon had never existed, if I'm remembering correctly. But I can remember enjoying it. And a great short essay on Pablo Neruda as well that I enjoyed. So yeah, I'd recommend it if you're curious about Mistral, but I can sort of see that it wouldn't be a book that I could openly recommend to everyone. Next up, one of those books that I've been working through for a bit. This is the complete stories of Edgar Allan Poe. I read a fair chunk of this in October, so I was really just finishing it off in November. I can't remember how far through I was, maybe like 2/3 of the way through, something like that. But I had a lot of fun with Poe. And I think it still stands that the more gothic, sort of macabre stories like the Mask of the Red Death and Hop Frog and stories like that tend to be my favourites. I particularly love the stories where, and it is quite interesting with Poe, where often it's not about, so say if you're reading a murder mystery or something, and this big event has happened, this big sort of explosion into real life, and then much of the action is about working out how it happened or picking up the pieces, finding out who did it, and it's about putting things back together again. With Poe, I think his best stories, and the thing that I love about him is that it's all just a big lead up to a massive explosion, and then it ends, and that's it. And I love that about Poe, and I think it is what makes his short stories so fun when they're at their best. And then another one that I've been working through for a bit, this is T.S. Eliot and his complete plays and poems. I read through the poems in August, and then since then, through October up until now, I've been trying to work through his plays. And it's sort of mixed bag for me with his plays. So I think in September at some point, I read Murder in the Cathedral, and then I think it was in October that then I read the Family Reunion and the Cocktail Party, maybe the Confidential Clerk as well. But then certainly in November, I read the last play, which was The Elder Statesman. The Elder Statesman is, I think, one of the stronger ones. I think really, I would recommend The Elder Statesman, The Cocktail Party, and Murder in the Cathedral. Murder in the Cathedral is a sort of medieval drama, very much in the vein of ancient Greek tragedy or of Shakespeare almost. And then essentially with the Family Reunion, he sort of stays in that very archaic vein, but tries to move it into a contemporary setting, and it just doesn't quite work. There's still something intriguing about it, but I don't think he quite pulls it off. And then he seems to have a real breakthrough with the Cocktail Party. There's an element of strangeness to it. All of these characters in the Cocktail Party have ulterior motives, and there's something quite shady and actually quite disturbing going on in the background, and it's sort of not until the end of the play that you actually work out what it is. It is quite an odd, absurd play that after reading The Family Reunion, you can suddenly take T.S. Eliot much more seriously as a dramatist once you've read The Cocktail Party, I think. And then The Confidential Clerk is okay. I think the problem I had with it was that I kind of got the impression it was supposed to be a comedy, but I only got that impression towards the end of the play. And so obviously there's maybe something wrong there. But then The Elder Statesman, which was really good, about a politician in old age going off to a sanatorium with his daughter, and it's essentially about his failings and his shortcomings, these sort of ghosts from his past that he can't escape from, who are reminding him of past versions of himself that he thought he'd outgrown or he'd left buried, and sort of realizing that he still doesn't quite live up to his own estimation, his own expectations for himself. A really good play, I thought, and again one that sort of redeemed him as a dramatist for me. So it's a bit of an up and down affair with his drama for me. He'd shoot it out the park, and then he'd sort of let it drop a bit with the next play, and then he'd redeem himself, and then again. So I'd recommend those three plays by Eliot: the Murder in the Cathedral, the Cocktail Party, and the Elder Statesman. And then I read a book that I've been saying a lot recently, that I've been having trouble with novels a bit this year. Sort of feeling like I'm almost outside the novel, looking in rather than being actually immersed into it. And there've still been novels that I've loved and enjoyed and have pulled me in eventually. But that's just been my sort of starting position for some reason. And this book was a real antidote to that. So since reading this, I haven't picked up another novel, but it's still nice to know that there are still novels that can pull me in and I have fun with. And the example, or the book in question, is The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafrón. And it's just a great sort of gothic, sort of like an adventure story, I suppose, or sort of like a mystery, about a boy who's growing up in Barcelona in the 1950s. His dad owns a bookshop, and there's this place called the Cemetery of Forgotten Books where, I mean, it's what it says on the tin, really. It's where people take books that have been forgotten about, whether they've just been left behind in a collection or have been banned or suppressed, or they're rare. And he comes across this book where it seems like there are no other copies anywhere else. And it is essentially then a mystery of working out who this author is, where he comes from, and why his books are so hard to come across. And Zafron very much wears his heart on his sleeve when it comes to his influences. Certainly early on in the book, you could get a sense of his love of Conan Doyle, I think. And then even though I haven't read Gaston Leroux or Alexandre Dumas, I think they're two writers that he really enjoys and he's having fun with, and he mentions a few times throughout the book. And so it is very much in the vein of a sort of sensational gothic novel. There is an element of it that's a little over the top, but I think it's supposed to be this kind of gothic excess. And for me, that's my kind of guilty pleasure, really. I love Anne Radcliffe through to sort of Wilkie Collins, that era, that kind of element, that mood, I really enjoy. And so this felt like that, but a little different, I suppose, with the context of the Spanish Civil War. And I think what I quite liked about it and appreciated about it was the fact that this book is set in the 1950s, and so many of the people who maybe were young during the Civil War, who may have fought in it or been involved in it in some way, are kind of middle-aged or a bit older by the time of most of the action in the book. And so it's sort of a book about the silence and the sort of mystery of this elder generation to the people who come after them, about this sort of repressed trauma, and the sort of action of the book and all the overblown stuff, I think, is a way of engaging with that slightly suppressed, slightly silenced trauma. At least that's sort of my reading of the book. But I would still recommend it. I have a lot of fun with it. And I think I tell this story a fair bit. I started this series at the end. So I read the last book, The Labyrinth of the Spirits, back in 2020, and then realised it was the last book in the series. So I've read this, and I've got the two books in the middle, and so I'll be trying to get to them at some point, but I'm not going to jump straight into them. I might start with them at the beginning of next year or something like that. And then the next book I read, some more poetry. I read through the complete poems of Hart Crane, a great American poet that a lot of, I think, is relatively familiar to a lot of American readers, but isn't really taught or mentioned that much over here. And I've always been intrigued by him. I've read excerpts from anthologies and things, but yeah, just really wanted to get a good idea of what his complete works were like, and on the whole had a lot of fun with Hart Crane. Again, there's something kind of excessive to Hart Crane, and I think it's something that Harold Bloom was talking about in the introduction to the book, is that he's trying to reach the sort of openness and the excessiveness and the sense of rolling on and on and on that you get in Wiman, and the way that Whitman's long, excessive, jam-packed lines sort of reflect the openness of the American landscape and the sense of possibility and diversity and all of this stuff that Whitman got really excited about, and I think Crane was also excited about. And certainly in his famous poem The Bridge, there's this sense that the Brooklyn Bridge, the sort of central image of the poem, is this sort of connective element to this sense of openness, that you could almost step straight from the bridge into the prairies or into the wilderness or something, and it's that sort of feeling that Crane is often trying to get towards. He also is obsessed with the sea, I think for similar reasons, and there he often channels Melville. And so two authors where, as he's channeling them, he can be a little over the top, I suppose, and sometimes, particularly in some of his later poetry, I find that a bit annoying, if I'm honest. I think particularly when people are imitating Whitman, it just never sounds as good as Whitman, and so I never enjoy it all that much. However, the thing that Bloom was saying is that the other model that I think he was actually, I mean, he does write about this author, but it's not necessarily someone he's trying to be like, I don't think, is Emily Dickinson. But he actually seems more authentic when his poems are a little more in her model than in Walt Whitman's model. I suppose the other poets that you'd lump in then would be Wallace Stevens, and I put Hart Crane in the same category as Wallace Stevens, of these great poets who are really eloquent and exciting to read, but I just know it's going to take a lot of rereading to find how they're significant to me, to sort of wheedle out the poems that I don't feel like I need to spend as much time with, and work out which ones to really double down on and spend time with. And they're not necessarily going to be the same poems as the anthologized poems. It's going to be my own personal selection of their work. And so I think with Stevens and with Crane, that's something that's going to be maybe a lifelong thing. And it's an interesting category of poets, because they're not my favourite poets. They're quite far from my favourite poets, and yet there's something that keeps pulling me back to them, and I try them again in a new context. And so yeah, that's probably all I have to say about Crane for the moment. But I'll be coming back to him, and I've starred a few poems in here, so I'll probably do a Hart Crane Poetry Thursday at some point. And then the last one to mention for books that I finished, I'm not going to talk about it too much because I want to make a separate video about it, is Faust by Johann, I always get the names mixed up, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This is translated by Walter Arndt and edited by Cyrus Hamlin, a great Norton critical edition. The only thing I find is missing in these Norton critical editions is an index, because there's so many sort of great essays and selections in the back, and I just only wish there was an index so I could find my own way of sort of connecting them and sort of jumping back to them with what seems pertinent to me. But that's just not something that they seem to do with these Nortons, which is a shame, because there's so much jam-packed in here, and I just only wish there was a simpler way to look it up. So that's the only downside to the edition. But I'll let you know a little more about Faust in its own dedicated video. And then on to what I'm reading at the moment. I've also been reading a fair bit more poetry. I'm currently approaching halfway with the collected poems of R.S. Thomas. It's quite a fun experience with R.S. Thomas. He's one of my dad's favourite poets, and then he's a poet I read a little bit at university, just mainly in the context of Welsh poetry or just Welsh literature in general, people writing about Welsh identity and stuff like that. And so he's a very important poet in that context. But it's been fascinating just to see how much more he has to say, and how much broader his concerns are. And even when he's writing specifically in the context of Wales, and of Welsh culture and the Welsh language, he is also speaking out to a much broader human tragedy, I think, with just what humanity has been doing to itself. I think really since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly in the 20th century. And yeah, maybe I'll discuss that a little bit more with again another Poetry Thursday dedicated to R.S. Thomas. But I've just been, I mean, like with Hart Crane, I've been, marking poems that stand out to me with asterisks, which isn't actually that helpful with R.S. Thomas, because most of the poems have asterisks next to them, which should, just go as a great recommendation for R.S. Thomas. I think for me, he seems to be one of the most readable and one of the most important poets for 20th century poetry. And it, what he has to say still speaks very powerfully into the 21st century as well. So yeah, I'd recommend it, even though I'm not even halfway through yet. I'd really recommend R.S. Thomas. I'm still in the Cantos. I made a video about the Cantos recently for Poetry Thursday, giving you a few of my ideas about what's going on in there and some of the bits I enjoy. And so I don't feel like I have much more to say at the moment. And then the other one I'm in the middle of, maybe about a third of the way through this book, is Zero Against the Bones, 50 Entries Against Despair by Christian Wiman, which has been really wonderful so far. Sort of like with R.S. Thomas, I feel like I could already recommend it, even though I haven't finished it. It's just a kind of book that I love, where the central idea is despair, about not necessarily how to avoid it in a self-helpy kind of way, but just circling around the idea and how people have dealt with it, and then in his own life how he's dealt with it, but also how he's kind of obsessed with it, and he's not always dealing with it directly, but there's this sense of sort of circling around an idea in various different ways. Some of these sections feel like like diary entries. Some of them are more fully fleshed out passages for a memoir. Other sections are sort of essays, or little pieces, little articles on other people's poems or other people's writings. And then there are his own poems that he puts in there as well. And then some of the really interesting entries are like pages from a commonplace book, where it's just a grouping of quotations and excerpts that slowly string together a theme. And so it's a really intriguing book, but really expertly done, and in its own way is a real page turner. So I'd recommend it. I'll maybe try to talk about it a little bit more once I've finished it, and I'll give you a few excerpts and things. But yeah, a really, really good book. And then going on into December, back in October, I started reading Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. Steve Donahue was doing a read aloud, and I was listening along and reading. as he read, and essentially it just got to a point where he had to stop doing the read aloud after a while, and then when he sort of realised that if he were to try and carry on, he wouldn't finish it by the end of the year, and so it sort of paused for the time being. So I've made the decision to carry on in December and to pick it back up, and I'm going to try and finish it by the end of the year. And then, if it turns out I enjoy the book, I'll have a lot of fun then listening to Steve read it and talk about it in the new year if he decides to do so. So that's one I'll be trying to get back to, and will hopefully finish before the year's end. And then I'm 2/3 of the way through my Faustian project. I've read Dr. Faustus by Marlowe and now Goethe's Faust, and so the one book I set myself that I still have left is Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann. And I love Thomas Mann, and I've been sort of obsessed with this Faustian project for a bit, and so this will be the last one. It is about 500 pages. The type is relatively small, actually, so at least compared to the book I'm reading at the moment, but not too small really, looking at it just on its own. So we'll see how much time it takes. I have heard that it's one of his more difficult books, so we'll see how it goes, but I'm excited to get back to Thomas Mann. And I think really as soon as I'm done with Christian Wiman, I'm going to jump into Thomas Mann, and then I'll have Trollope sort of in the background, just sort of dipping in and out. And then maybe if I finish Thomas Mann, I will make Trollope more of my focus once I've finished that. We'll see. And then in terms of poetry, I want to read this book that I picked up recently. This is Drift by Caroline Bergvall. Let's see if you can make that out. I just find it really intriguing as a concept. I think I'm always quite intrigued by seafaring stories. I'm not entirely sure why. And this is taking this sort of idea of sort of Anglo-Saxon sort of wanderer songs and seafaring songs, and recapturing that, and then sort of moving it into a more modern context. And so the central, I think, metaphor of the poem is this sense of being cut adrift, as the title may suggest. And yeah, I don't really know how much more to say about it. There's not much information on the book itself about what it's about, but it does seem quite experimental. As I've shown before, there are bits in it that are, I mean, even from the flipping through that I've seen, even these scribbles, if you know much about sort of the Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon sort of alphabet, it is still significant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's. I mean, who knows what it'll be like to get to these weird scribbly bits, after reading some of the actual sort of moments of poetry in there. So again, not too much to say about it at this point, but we'll see what it's like to read through, and it will be one I try to read through quite quickly, I think, in as few sittings as possible, so I can sort of experience the book in one sort of fluid sort of movement. And then the last one that I've put down is an author I've been meaning to get to for some time, and I don't want to throw in too many books for December, because me and my wife have a bit of a tradition around Christmas to sort of recommend a book to each other, and so we do a little book swap around Christmas, and so there's going to be an element of randomness to my December reading with that in mind, but I do also around Christmas or just before the new year, try to read a book, generally a book that isn't too long, that feels a bit like a present to myself almost. And so in the past, reading stuff by Edmund de Waal, who I really like, or Patrick Leigh Fermor, seems to be a way to sort of give myself a little present towards the end of the year. I'm going to I want to read something from an author that it's just been too long since I read anything by him, and that's Robert Macfarlane. And I'd like to read The Wild Places, and yeah, maybe read it in that week between Christmas and the New Year, and that'll be my little present to myself. And that's really it. And so we'll see how I do. The Trollope and the Thomas Mann together at the same time, now that I've actually thought about it, seems a little daunting. So now I'm not sure how much space I'm going to have. But I mean, we'll see how it goes. And I think both of those will feel a little more familiar to me than Faust. So I think it'll be fairly quicker reading as well. But we'll see how that goes. But for now, I think I'll leave it there. So please, yeah, let me know, what you thought of any of these books, if you've read any of them, if you have any recommendations based off any of them, and let me know what you've been reading and what you plan to try and read before the end of the year. So for now, thank you very much for watching. I hope you're doing very well, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.